All right, let's get into it. This is a story about data, democracy, and a system that was designed not just to watch you, but to actually change you. And right at the center of it all is the person who blew the whistle, Christopher Wylie, the pink-haired data scientist who exposed the Cambridge Analytica scandal. This quote from Wylie, it really gets right to the heart of the whole thing. You know, before this, we might have thought about mass data collection as something governments did to spy on other governments. But Wylie showed us that the game had completely changed. Private companies were now making you, the individual scrolling through your feed, the target. And just look at the scale we're talking about here. 87 million, that's how many Facebook profiles were harvested, most of them without anyone's consent, and then handed over to a political firm called Cambridge Analytica. Think about that. Millions of people's personal stories, their likes, their private connections, all turned into a political weapon. So how in the world did this happen? And how did one insider manage to expose the entire playbook for, well, hacking democracy? To really understand the explosion this caused, we've got to go back to the beginning and meet the brilliant and pretty conflicted architect of the system himself. So where does this story even begin? Well, long before he was testifying in front of governments, Christopher Wylie was a neurodivergent kid in rural Canada. He was an outsider, and that meant he saw the world in a completely different way.
Because he was always on the outside looking in, Wylie started to see patterns that most of us just miss. He figured out that all this data we're creating, our opinions, our likes, our friends, it isn't just random noise. It's actually a map of the invisible social forces that shape our lives. And that led him to a question that would define his entire career. If you can measure what people are afraid of, can you use that fear to shape the choices they make?
This obsession with data eventually took him to London, where he got involved with a new, shady political consultancy. This place had some seriously powerful backers, like the billionaire Robert Mercer and strategist Steve Bannon. And it was there, at Cambridge Analytica, that his big theoretical questions started to become a pretty terrifying reality. And this is the key. We're not just talking about demographics, your age or your zip code. Psychographics goes way, way deeper. Cambridge Analytica didn't just care about what you liked. They wanted to build a complete psychological profile of who you are so they could predict and eventually change your behavior. Now, to help people really get how powerful and, frankly, how dangerous this is, Wylie came up with this perfectly chilling analogy. It really explains the messed up power dynamic at play. Okay, imagine you go on a blind date. This person sitting across from you seems perfect. They love all the same music, they watch the same shows, it feels like fate. But what you don't know is that they've spent the last 2 years secretly studying you. They've read your texts, talked to your friends, they know everything. You'd be completely vulnerable to manipulation, right? Because they have all the information and you have none. And boom, that's how Wylie describes Facebook's entire business model. The platform and the advertisers using it, they are that stalker just on a massive global scale. You see content that feels like it was made just for you, but you have no idea what the real motivation is or just how much data is being used to make you feel that way. For Wylie, that initial, almost academic fascination with data started to go sour. He began to see how these powerful tools were actually being used, and it led to a massive crisis of conscience. And this really was the turning point. I mean, on one hand, the promise was almost noble. Let's use data to map the hidden forces in society. But the reality? It was dark. They were building psychological weapons to manipulate entire populations for political reasons. And that gap between the promise and the reality just became too big for Wylie to ignore. He had a front row seat as Cambridge Analytica launched what looked like a totally harmless personality quiz on Facebook. But this quiz had a secret, hidden function. It didn't just collect data from the person taking it. It reached into their entire network and scraped the profiles of all their friends, none of whom ever consented. The line between research and mass surveillance just completely vanished. The real breaking point came in 2016. He watched as the tools he helped create were used during the Brexit vote and then the US election, pushing divisive messages and preying on people's deepest fears. He knew he was part of it, and he decided to do something incredibly dangerous. He started secretly copying everything: contracts, code, presentations, building a mountain of evidence. And then, in 2018, he was ready to talk. After the story broke, Wylie went from being a total unknown to a global figure, testifying before governments around the world. But his testimony leaves us with a really important question. Years later, has anything actually changed? And this is Wylie's big warning to all of us. Sure, the company Cambridge Analytica is gone, but the people who worked there, they've just scattered, taking their skills to other campaigns and companies. The data they gathered could still be floating around out there. And maybe the scariest part, the playbook they wrote is now available for any country to copy and use against its own people or others. Which brings us to the fundamental question Wylie really wants us to think about. Facebook says it's made things more secure, that this can't happen again. But can we really be sure? This is Wylie's core argument today. Why on earth are we trusting a single, for-profit company to be the referee for our entire political conversation online, especially a company that has a track record of hiding problems until they're forced to admit them? He says trusting them to protect democracy is like putting all of our eggs in one very, very shaky basket. At the end of the day, the Cambridge Analytica scandal ripped the curtain back and showed us that our social media feeds aren't neutral spaces. They're battlegrounds for our attention, for our emotions, and for our votes. The tools of manipulation didn't go away, they've just gotten smarter. Which leaves all of us with a pretty unsettling question. When you're scrolling through your feed, who is really shaping what you believe?